Well, welcome back to Open Exchange. Infrastructure continues to come up as Africa's biggest challenge to overcome because it stops growth, it stops development, slows these things. What can be done to address this problem? I'm joined now in the studio by Ibrima Faal, who is Regional Director for the Southern Africa Resource Centre at the African Development Bank, and Mike Pio, who's Head of Infrastructure, Energy and Telecommunications at Nedbank Capital. Mike, if I could ask you to kick off, it's a bit like tapering in the fiscal cliff. You know, this word keeps coming up, and like those words, it appears it's not easy to solve. So on the one hand, you've got appetite for infrastructure. Everyone sees we need better infrastructure. Governments have an appetite for it. The people have an appetite. There's no shortage of investor money, we are told.
Right.
What's the problem?
Okay, David, so I think you're absolutely correct. I think we have this absolutely unprecedented need for infrastructure in Africa, and the imperative is being drawn increasingly by the demand that is coming out of China and India for the resources. So for the first time, we really have the commodities coming online. We're having billions of dollars spent on exploration for oil and gas on the east coast of Africa as well as on the west coast. The problem at the moment is the connectivity, getting the ports and the road and rail infrastructure to be able to deliver these resources and commodities to the markets that demand them. So I think you're right, we have never seen as much demand for the actual asset class. We have European and American investors for the first time significantly putting up their hands to play in this space, and the problem is still the lack of projects. I think the short answer is that they are normally extremely big, large-scale developmental type projects, and I think the biggest constraint at the moment is the political will to make the projects happen. The project development cycles are running through multiple election cycles, and a lot of the politicians are still focused on short-term political cycles.
So the problem is that the road, rail, ports can't keep up. So now there's it's another problem which is causing that problem. Political will, Mike has identified as the issue, and yet on the other hand, governments want to do these things.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely crucial. I mean, Mike raised the point about the resources that need to be moved. But also you can add to that fact the extremely fast pace of urbanization that's taking place in the continent, putting more pressure actually on infrastructure demand. So on the one hand you have commodities, on the other hand you have the actual demographics itself, which is an opportunity, but at the same time demands that you have the infrastructure in place to support that. I think with regard to the governments, I think now you're beginning to see some political championing coming out, especially out of the PIDA projects, where you have now a strategic framework that defines the main transformative infrastructure required in the continent, a total of $360 billion across energy, transport, ICT, and transboundary water. Of that, they have prioritized about $68 billion up to 2020 as the priority infrastructure projects that must be in place by that time. So I think the political championing is now taking place in this area. I think President Zuma is championing the North-South corridor. And of course, you have other presidents in the continent championing other aspects.
Now, as the African Development Bank, you know, one thinks of when you see big deals happen, they always have a list at the bottom of the sponsors and the merchant banks and the specialists in these fields. Presumably, that's what you do, Mike. So, isn't there some way that these guys who advise, who help, who support, can come up with new things, and particularly African Development Bank, in a sense, that's your job?
Yeah.
So, is there innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the issue has never been, I don't think, is financing. It is, but in a way, a different part of it. I mean, like I said, we have these projects in PIDA, for example. 51 priority projects, about 36 of those still need preparation, some level of preparation and bankability. So once you're able to bring those projects on board, the private investors will come in. Essentially, you're de-risking
so
the
is
projects
it packaging?
for the private. It's packaging, really.
It's not that the money is not there or that the investment's not, investors aren't willing. Packaging, is that what you do, and what makes you bang your head against the wall?
Okay, David, absolutely. So Ibrahim has referred to things like the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. Yeah. I mean, there are programs now where governments are working collectively to try to develop the regulatory framework. So one of the biggest inhibiting factors historically has been the lack of regulatory frameworks that allow you to, for example, or allow the private sector to invest in toll roads or in rail infrastructure in given countries. So increasingly, there are regional initiatives to try to make the regulatory changes as seamless across multiple jurisdictions as possible, which help to make it bankable. Also, one of the historic or legacy type problems has been the lack of funding for the early stage bankable feasibility. And again, I think institutions like African Development Bank, the World Bank and the IFC are now have realized this and are starting to provide specific funding to get projects to bankability. So the capital only really arrives when a project is at an acceptable stage of de-risking, when the regulatory framework says it's possible to actually construct, own and operate a piece of infrastructure for a particular period. And then obviously the institutions are normally pretty good at assessing their ability to get repaid that money, assessing the actual the supply side and the ability for users of the system to be able to generate the cash flows to repay the projects.
And Mike made a very important point. I mean, it's not just the bankability, but then how do you structure the actual financing afterwards? And also, how do you then make the project itself self-sustaining in terms of being able to generate?
But surely all of these things, there are more than enough experts able to work out these things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that this is where the last point I was going to make was basically that it has to generate its own essentially fees to pay off whatever financing is going to go into place. The bank is now working on innovative instruments, essentially admitting that we have reached the limits of donor funding for infrastructure. We have reached the limits of government funding for infrastructure. So you must think outside the box. We are now looking at what is called the Africa 50 Fund, which we're thinking of it as a $10 billion fund, but one that can catalyze another, maybe a factor of 1 to 10. So we'll be able to do infrastructure, but not only the financing, but the preparation, as Mike was saying, establishing the bankability of the projects for private sector to come in.
Mike, is there an example that shows us the way, where something has been done, it's overcome these difficulties?
David, I think there are lots of projects across Africa. One of the most amazing success stories in recent times has been South Africa's renewable energy procurement process, which is still busy unfolding. We're into round 3 now. But it really talks to a situation where in South Africa we probably developed 10 large-scale PPP projects in 10 years, notwithstanding the fact that we had well-developed legislative frameworks to do public-private partnerships. But with the Department of Energy's renewable energy program, we suddenly developed 49 projects that have been banked to date in the period of inside of 1 year. So really, I think where governments commit to a program, communicate what the program is going to be, and then really stick to the program, that's the right way to go, because that's how you procure infrastructure on a very large scale. There are lots of projects. We're currently working on a project in Kenya with the African Development Bank called Lake Turkana. It's a 300 megawatt wind farm. And again, it's a combination of public-private sector funding, but with a government that's been highly committed to procuring this renewable energy. So it's a great example of.
Well, we've just scratched the surface, but you've given me a bit more heart, because so many of these discussions go in the circle, and not that you're wanting to go in a circle, but it seems the people out there are going in circles, and it seems like we're beginning to get some movement. I just want to finish off, quote from a report by Deloitte that says that investors want to be involved in projects that are high priority for government and are likely to come to a conclusion. I think it's a question of faith as well. Thanks to Ebrima Fal, who is Regional Director for the Southern Africa Resource Centre at the African Development Bank, and Mike Payer, who is Infrastructure, Energy and Telecoms Head at Nedbank Capital.